Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Natalia Lermer and I will be the facilitator of this webinar today. Our presenter today is Marlene Moore. Thank you for joining ANAB for a complimentary webinar on the safety of drinking water using ISO IEC 17025 accredited testing and sampling. Please note, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Before we begin, some logistics. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions asked. Before we begin, I'd love to introduce to you Marlene Moore. Marlene has managed and performed work for full-service sampling and testing laboratories. She majored in chemistry at Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and has attended and provided a variety of management businesses and technical training courses. Marlene has worked and managed sampling and testing laboratories for more than 20 years. Her current work includes auditing to client requirements, assessing laboratory accreditation programs to ISO IEC 17025, as well as ISO IEC 17065. She also provides consulting and auditing and does training on quality management for organizational and project management relative to sampling and testing and data collection activities of the environmental, chemical, and biological applications. Welcome, Marlene. We are so glad to have you. And with that, I will pass presentation rights to Marlene so Marlene can take over and take us through the webinar. Again, welcome and get comfortable. I'm sorry, I think we're having some technical difficulties. Marlene, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I had too many mute buttons to be able to unhook. Thank you, Natalia, for inviting me to do this and take my years of experience and be able to present it, to be able to show why accreditation is helps to make sure the drinking water that we drink is safe and make it available to all people around the world. Accreditation is right now the 17025 2017 version is all about sampling, testing, and calibration. So we're going to talk about how that demonstrates competency of an organization that's doing testing and or sampling. One of the reasons you want to do accreditation because you want to be able to make sure the organization is managed to make sure they can generate data of known and documented quality, make sure the data they produce is provides reliable and valid results. You want to make sure the results are reported accurately and reported impartially. And we're going to look at the confidence that this provides to the organizations that are using our data to know that their sampling and testing was performed by competent personnel and the organization itself. So one thing that I always get asked about is, are drinking water safe? Well, a laboratory cannot tell you that. They can only tell you if it meets the Safe Drinking Water Act. In the U.S., we're talking about the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is published in 40 CFR Part 141. That's the law. The law says this is how we test drinking water and ensure the safety of it. Health and safety is met. And every public utility that provides water to their public, the businesses, individuals, must monitor their water system. And again, what they monitor for is described in the regulation. When they sample, how to test, that's all part of the permit they get from the state that they're getting their authorization to distribute that water from. They get authorized to distribute water in any given locale, and that they get permitted. And that permit will describe the sampling and testing that needs to be done so that water meets the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. A testing lab has to obtain certification. Under the law, there's a law in 40 CFR 141. It talks about certification of a laboratory, and the rules are all stated there of what a laboratory must do, and they get audited to those requirements. These are all the rules to help ensure that the water is safe to drink, but rules are not always followed. We've seen charges lately. I've seen them over the years. They've been going on ever since the time of this program started back in the 1970s. There were charges filed against Flint that you've all read about, and a lot of that is about, it says it's about a testing lab, and it's not really the testing lab, it's about the sampling and the mismanagement that went on. So every time there's a water quality problem, the first thing we do is we look at the laboratory to find out, because that's who generates the data. So it must be the laboratory's fault. That's why we have this water quality problem. And often that's not the case. Water quality problems in Flint were one of many incidents that have happened over the years. But the problem in Flint was sample collection and management of the problem. And if you really look at and dig into the details of that, that's what you'll find. The four officials that were charged were really with felonies. They were charged because they didn't follow the drinking water rules. And they did false statements. They made a lot of false statements. And if you read the EPA's Inspector General report, they reported that there was a lot of misreporting of sample collection and test data, and that's one of the biggest concerns the Inspector General of EPA has right now with water quality problems that are happening. It's a mismanagement. Management usually is, if management isn't done correctly, that is why you get some of these problems occurring, whether it's the management of the utility, the management of the regulation, the management of the laboratory, the management of the sample collection. All of that has to be looked at, and that's why we have water quality problems. These are just a couple documents that EPA has put out from the Office of Inspector General about the problems with water quality in the laboratory. And when you really read these documents, you will find a lot of reasons water quality problems happen because of mismanagement of a laboratory. The laboratory's integrity is brought under question when a laboratory starts to take shortcuts. They start to do things too quick. They have to get more data out than they can possibly produce in a day. And the people are screaming for that data, and they start to take shortcuts. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes laboratories get mismanaged, because they're managed just to produce the data, not to produce it right. But also, if you read these documents, there's a big section on this in Appendix E of the 2014 document where it talks about sample collection is a part of the problem. Samples aren't collected from the right locations. They're not collected correctly. There are sometimes shortcuts taken with that. They label samples taken from one site and they're really taking it from another site. That's all part of mismanagement of the sample collection. But sample collection isn't usually done by the laboratory. It's usually done by the utility or by another organization that collects the sample and brings it to the lab. So the laboratory has no control on how that sample is collected. And that's one of the other reasons we have integrity problems in our drinking water testing. So again, a laboratory cannot tell you if your water is safe to drink. Laboratories provide the data that helps you to compare those numbers to public rules, what the public says they want in their water. That is the law that was passed. Laboratories don't collect the samples. The sample location, if I don't know where the samples come from, I can only report what the custody form has on it, and they said it was taken from this house on this date and time, and that's what I put in my report. But I don't collect those samples, so I never can be sure of where that sample came from, and that causes a lot of integrity problems. So the laboratory has to be able to verify that sample collection point and or not be held accountable for the data being known and documented quality, because they can't really know the quality of the water if they don't know where the sample comes from. Again, a laboratory is only one part of the entire process of generating reliable data. Well, before I go on, you have to ask yourself, what's a laboratory then? Well, in ISO 17025, they changed the definition in 2017, and they added sampling as something that's done for sample collection, and it requires subsequent testing and or calibration. So a body that performs one or more of testing, calibration, and or sampling, they are a laboratory. In the environmental field, laboratories typically, many labs do not do sample collection. That's done usually by an engineering firm or the public utility or who's ever taking those samples, wherever the industry is who's collecting those samples. That's usually done by another party. The samples then get shipped into a laboratory, and the laboratory verifies the information by checking pH, checking the preservation, checking to see it was cooled properly, and reporting that either to a state agency and or the client who actually submitted it. So again, with 17025, 2017, sampling, if a laboratory and or organization is collecting a sample that's going to be done by subsequent testing and or calibration, that sampling can now be part of their scope of accreditation. That is now acceptable in the accreditation realm. But the certification of drinking water, remember I said a drinking water lab has to be certified. It's under the law. So the Safe Drinking Water Act requires states to audit laboratories for testing public supplies. Public supplies have to be tested by a certified lab. The state certifies the labs. Again, the labs have to use approved methods that are published in the law. So when the state comes in to certify a laboratory, they're verifying if that method is being run correctly. So each time a laboratory is doing a drinking water test, they have to follow the EPA method exactly. If it's not, it's considered a problem, and that's written up in the audit reports. The states can decide what kind of oversight they want to have for the field sampling or field testing. There's some tests that are done in the field, like pH, chlorine residual, dissolved oxygen, conductivity. Those tests are done on site in the field by typically whoever the sample collector is. There's no accreditation in many states for those activities. Some states do, but many states don't do accreditation or don't do certification. Again, there's no federal specific requirements for field testing or sample collection at this time. There is some guidance. There are some things that it talks about, again, to making sure that it's done correctly. Sometimes the permit and or state will have requirements in their state laws, but it's very different. There's 50 different ways to do that in this country, in the U.S. So there is kind of a big hole there, whether somebody is doing it correctly or not, and there's really no certification, except for one or two states that do certification of field testing, but not the sample collection. Accreditation is really demonstrating your competence to be an organization that does sampling, testing, or calibration. It helps to assure that implementation of things that you've documented, you're doing what you say you do. If you say you're going to collect that sample using a bottle that's properly treated, it is done that way. If other organizations may just go out and collect the sample in a bottle and bring it back to you. So making sure that person who collects that sample is doing it properly and is competent and has the skills and writes down the proper documentation of how they do it is very important, and that's why accreditation is so important. So accreditation helps to assure that. You help to assure the competency of the person, and also you want to assure the competency of the management to make sure that management knows they're running a business where they have to continuously improve the processes. Science is not stagnant. These regulations are not stagnant. They change all the time. And one of the big things that accreditation does is helps an organization to manage that change and continuously improve their operations to meet the changing needs of the environment. Certification does not. Certification only helps to ensure that you're using the right method at the right time. That's it. They only look at method certification. So again, it's limited. Accreditation is more broad, ensures the competency of the whole organization, not just the analyst, and to make sure they have the skills and expertise to be able to run those tests. So all aspects of the organization or operation has to be managed, and helps to ensure the operation is working properly, and it doesn't just happen. In many organizations that I go into, it is about, we have to look at it and say, the organization sometimes just happens because this is the way we've always done it. Well, that's not right. That organization should constantly be moving forward and knowing what it is that they have to do to be able to ensure that data is generated properly. So when we talk about conformity assessment, which is what 17025 is, it's a standard on conformity assessment. It's about first party, second party, and third party. People, we don't normally talk like that, but a laboratory is a party who generates data, and they generate that data for a customer. That customer is a second party. The first party is actually the people who generate that water sample, who generate that water in the distribution system. That's the first party. The second party is the consumer who uses that water. Again, the laboratory is just one of the people in this process, and they, in a conformity assessment environment, that laboratory has to be somebody who is a third party and is independent of a first party or second party. They can't be the producer of the water. They can't be the user of the water. They have to be impartial. And that's very hard to get somebody that does that. Many utilities have their own testing labs. Those testing labs are second-party organizations. You don't know if that testing is being done by an independent organization. Are they under the same management? Are they being managed by the operator of the plant, which wants to make sure the water is in compliance? That's one of the biggest problems we have in the drinking water and wastewater and other environmental businesses, is because they're not impartial. There can be undue influence to make sure that they don't have a violation. Because you don't want to end up in the newspaper saying this water is not safe to drink because they don't do it right. Well, that's because the organization that's doing the testing is working for the operator of the plant, and they don't want that water to become a headline. But by using an accredited lab, they have to demonstrate their impartiality, and they're making sure they don't have any undue influence to generate data that is appropriate and represents that sample as it's received into the laboratory. And or if they collect the sample, they're going to have to make sure that sample is collected properly and then taken to the lab and generated and handled properly throughout the whole process. So depending on whether your laboratory, your third-party accredited lab, is doing the sample collection and or just doing the testing, will depend on how reliable the whole process is. The other term that's used in ISO 17000, we're talking about conformity assessment, is audit. The audit is really the process of getting the relevant information about that water and evaluating it objectively and determining the extent of the specified requirements. So I'm testing drinking water. I not only have to know what the specified requirements are and what the drinking water rules are, I have to make sure my testing meets the requirements of that law. If I'm testing other stuff, I have to know what laws I'm being asked to meet, environmentally especially. Again, an audit is used in terms of management systems. It's used in terms of the EPA drinking water program. They use certification. They want to do an audit. The audit is looking at those specified requirements, very detailed, and they look at those specified requirements to make sure they are met by the laboratory. For accreditation purposes, we don't use the word audit. We call it assessment. Assessment is more of an evaluation, not just a audit of the process. The audit of the process is typically used in certification. The assessment is what we use in accreditation. In the Drinking Water Act, when we certify a laboratory, again, the SDWA mandates that audits are performed on testing laboratories and provide service to the public water supplies. If they're providing a service to a public water supply, they must be audited. Again, drinking water labs must be visited every 2 or 3 years. The drinking water program itself, EPA comes in and does oversight of that activity by the state organizations to make sure the requirements are being met. And the states can set up their own rules as long as they're more stringent than federal rules. Federal rules say you have to audit a laboratory every 3 years. But some states do it every 2 years because they realize by letting it go too long, they might have problems in the water supply. The laboratory may be having problems generating the data, which may cause them problems in the water supply. But again, remember, Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't specify anything for sample collection and or field testing. The federal law doesn't talk about that at all. We talk about assessment as an accreditation body. We're talking about what we're going to use for oversight of the accreditation body. There is a peer evaluation that goes on. So all the accreditation bodies in the international, the ILAC and IAF realm, we always do a look at the evaluation of those organizations to make sure they're implementing their requirements right. ISO, IEC 17011 are the requirements of the accreditation body. The accreditation body has to meet the requirements on a peer evaluation to make sure they're implementing all the requirements of 17025 when they go in to do an assessment of a laboratory. Typically the audit is really done by a laboratory. When they do their internal audit, they're doing it in accreditation. They have to do that every year. And that internal audit is a self-examination of whether they're following their procedures, whether they're doing everything right, whether they're doing everything, they need improvement in some areas. So again, the laboratory, if it's being managed properly, they will find their own problems before the assessor ever gets there. If the assessor comes in and finds a lot of problems, typically the internal audit is not functioning correctly. Because if the internal audit isn't finding problems, the assessor will. And that's the check and balances. The laboratory can audit their own work. The assessor comes in and evaluates what the laboratory is doing to see if they're doing a thorough enough job, seeing if they're being impartial, ensuring they are independent of the activity they're actually auditing. And that's one of the things we do when we're doing an assessment. And that's the difference between accreditation and certification. In the TNI, which is the NELAC Institute, they follow the requirements of 17011, and they require when they're doing when they're doing any type of accreditation of environmental laboratories, they recognize state ABs that ensure their accreditation has to be renewed every 2 years, and it makes it streamlined. That recognition is done. Has to be done every 3 years. They go in and verify the accreditation body is doing it right within the TNI standards, and they evaluate the accreditation bodies. We have 14 states now that are doing accreditation bodies under TNI, which are different from the Safe Drinking Water Act because they're doing accreditation, not certification. But EPA has recognized the similarities between accreditation and certification, and they accept that accreditation by from the states that are recognized under TNI as being equivalent to their Safe Drinking Water Act program, because at least it meets the minimum requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So TNI recognizes government ABs, but they also recognize non-government ABs like ANAB. They actually recognize them as non-governmental accreditation bodies. They aren't ultimately responsible for drinking water, but they can help a state out to be able to do assessments for them and be able to do the reporting of that, and they will do that for a state that wants it. So that is a new change that's been going on. The state of California is now using non-governmental ABs to evaluate their drinking water, wastewater, and waste program in the state of California because they don't have the necessary resources to do it. They've recognized that, but California is not a TNI state, but they are adopting the TNI requirements for an accreditation body to make sure that they're doing it correctly. And they're doing it according to the international realm, and they're making sure it's done according to TNI standards, because the TNI standard is a lot more prescriptive than 17025. So that's why it's equivalent. And TNI also has standards to address field sampling and field testing. We call them field sampling and measurement organizations. There's a separate standard for that. And we do go out, it's voluntary, we do go out and ask people if they want to get accredited to that, they can do that. So that is a lot of different things that can be done under accreditation rather than certification. TNI accreditation is divided up into various programs. We have environmental lab program for the laboratories. That's found in volume 1 and 2 of the TNI environmental lab standards. We also have field sampling and measurement organizations, which has in volume 1 and 2 of the field sampling standards, how accreditation body actually operates. And the field sampling organizations, we always use accreditation bodies that are third parties, or we just call them accreditation bodies. We don't call them NGABs. The drinking water, the environmental lab calls them NGABs, non-governmental accreditation bodies, because they also have governmental accreditation bodies. We also have a program for proficiency testing where organizations generate proficiency tests. They have to be accredited by a oversight body that is doing it. But so there is a whole program for that. There's a lot of other programs that TNI has developed for the environmental testing and sampling industry. So you have to think about, when you use the word certified, do you really mean certified or do you mean accredited? There's a big difference. In 17,000 of the ISO IEC 17,000 2020, the word certification is a third-party attestation related to the object of conformity assessment, with the exception of accreditation. Accreditation is a third-party attestation related to a conformity assessment body conveying formal demonstration of its competence, consistent operation, and impartiality to performing specific conformity assessment activities. Look at the difference in those definitions, and that really describes the Safe Drinking Water Act as a certification program, and the accreditation program that is done, the assessment program that ANAB does for accreditation of drinking water labs can be done under accreditation. It's not recognized under the certification program unless a state recognizes them. The state has jurisdiction. So the law says you have to be certified, but that state can accept an accredited organization if that state so desires, as long as it's equivalent in the requirements. So again, the regulations have to be met under the accreditation program, either accreditation or certification program. There's no difference there, but there are a lot more requirements under accreditation because you have to be able to demonstrate the competency and the impartiality of the organization that's doing that work. So conformity assessment demonstrates that the specified requirements are fulfilled. The specified requirements in this case are the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. So whenever you're testing drinking water, you have to know what it is that you're testing. One note, the Safe Drinking Water Act is only for public water supply. homeowner can have a well, they can have their own water supply, and that is not under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So clients, people had farms, they had houses that had drinking water, well water. They would bring samples to me and say, is my water safe to drink? I would say, well, I can tell you if it meets the drinking water standards for certain tests, but you can't test for everything. You're only going to be able to test for a few things. We can test for these 2 or 3 things. Some cities, some municipalities actually had certificate of occupancies that had to be gotten by the homeowner to be able to demonstrate that the water met drinking water, coliform bacteria, and nitrates. That's it. Safe Drinking Water Act requires a lot more. So again, you have to understand the local laws if you're a drinking water lab to know what is the right thing to test for. But a laboratory will never say on their report your water is safe to drink. It'll say it meets the drinking water requirements. It'll tell you which ones they meet. That's it. For the items tested, that's all they can talk about. Accreditation bodies are only talking about the accreditation of the organization that they reviewed. Again, the accreditation bodies are peer-reviewed, peer-evaluated every 4 years. International accreditation, ILAC and IEF do that. And they will look at their 17,011 requirements to make sure that accreditation body is implemented, make sure they're implementing 17025 correctly and properly the way the other organizations, other accreditation bodies around the world are doing it. They will look at their scope of accreditation, and the scope of accreditation is really what is requested by the laboratory. So the laboratory asks the accreditation body for their scope of accreditation. They don't have to get accredited for everything they do. They have to say specifically what they need accreditation for. Most laboratories get accredited for everything, but some laboratories do not. They only get accredited to certain tests that the clients need to make sure it's accredited and or certified. When they do the peer evaluation of an accreditation body, they're really trying to build confidence, of course, across international lines. Again, one of the things about all this, which was started back in the 70s, they wanted to have one accreditation that was good anywhere in the world. If you get accredited under 17025 by a recognized accreditation body through the ILAC, IF, MOU, or multilateral arrangement, that means that laboratory test, whenever that's generated, that's on their scope of accreditation. When that laboratory generates that value, you can trust in the reliability of that number, the accuracy, the reporting of it, and make sure it is correct. Labs can still make mistakes, but most of the time they will ensure they correct that mistake and they permanently fix it. It doesn't keep happening over and over again. That's one of the beauties of accreditation. That is part of the management. Again, if you're an accreditation body, you have to make sure you do that as well. Laboratories have to make sure their management can make continuous improvement and demonstrate they don't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So the scope of accreditation always now includes, and this is out of 17,011, what are you testing? What component or parameter are you characterizing in that with that test? What types of tests are performed? And where appropriate, the techniques are used. So this is just some of the things, and these are required by both the Drinking Water Act and TNI. In the sampling, we now have in 17,011, and the ABs can do a flexible scope. And sometimes we're looking at flexible scopes for sample collection. If an AB wants to accredit a laboratory for sampling for subsequent testing and or calibration, they can do that using this flexible scope. And this is some of the items that are going to be defined by ABs that are going to be in their flexible scopes. They have to define the standards, like the normative standards that they're using. They have to make sure the conformity assessment scheme, if it's relevant, like a TNI, if they're using a TNI scheme, because that could be a scheme to actually certify sampling or credit sampling and measurement organizations. They could use that scheme. And the industry-specific requirements like permit requirements or quality assurance project plan requirements, all that stuff to be part of that scope of accreditation. that is a flexible scope. And every AB has to develop how they're going to do a flexible scope. If you want to see the complexity of a conformity assessment body, especially just a laboratory, this is actually found in 17,025, 2017 in Figure B3. This shows you have a test item coming in, and sampling, you notice there is a dot. There's actually a dot around the sampling because laboratories, if they're not doing sampling, then it doesn't become part of the conformity assessment. It only starts with the sampling receipt. So this is all the item going through the lab, and these are all the support functions that are needed by that laboratory in order to produce that result. So you have the sample coming in, you have the request that comes in from a client that goes through all this validation and use and making sure the evaluation of the product is correct, and then the results get reported, and that goes out in the report. If it's not correct, it comes back in the beginning, and they can file a complaint and say this report is correct, and they can go back in and check it all the way through because the documentation and the records have to be so detailed that they come back and try to figure out what went wrong with that test. And the same thing could be true if you used sampling, sample collection in the process of laboratory operations. So one of the things that EPA has recognized that one of the major sources of data variability is sample collection, not the analysis. We've tightened down so hard on the analysis nowadays with these rigorous methods, and usually the uncertainty, the variability of these methods is usually within 20%, but you can't get better data unless you start looking at the sample collection. Again, what are you trying to represent with that sample? Are you representing the whole water supply, or just the water at that tap, or just the water in that bottle? A laboratory right now that doesn't do sampling, they are only responsible for looking at that water in that bottle. The rest of that is up to the user, has to understand that whole thing. So again, a laboratory is not going to necessarily have all the elements they need to be able to reduce that data variability. Only the user has that authority, has that ability to do that. So these are some things you have to talk about planning. If you look at 17,025 under sampling, it talks about making sure you have a plan for your sample collection activity and making sure you evaluate the risks to make sure those risks are properly identified and properly controlled and implemented properly. Again, you have to have proper management to do this. Right now in the drinking water program, it doesn't say you have to do this. So again, accreditation really helps to reduce data variability. And some of the ways you can do that, and this was even in the Inspector General report, 2014, about what you would have to do to be able to start to reduce this variability or these fraudulent practices. You have to have a sampling design. You have to have a sample collection method. You may have to have making sure the personnel are competent to perform them. So that's all part of it, okay? Sample collection is a main part of this whole process. 17025 actually lists the whole thing there, which you should have in a sample collection report. A laboratory is not going to reduce this right now if they're not doing sample collection. But if you want to make sure it's accredited, the sampling is accredited, these are the types of things that have to be looked for in a test report or a sampling report that you get from a laboratory and or sampling organization. Again, ask yourself, who's responsible for the samples that are being collected in your water supply? The EPA website talks about making sure laboratories are certified by EPA or a state lab. Make sure they're successfully analyzing PT proficiency test samples, making sure they use appropriate methods, and pass periodic on-site audits. EPA recommends, not a requirement, that the state laboratory certification program and certified labs develop standard operating procedures. TNI and the accreditation, TNI especially, mandates you have to have a documented procedure, and it tells you what has to be in it. EPA only recommends it. You have to develop standard operating procedures, helps deter fraud, make sure people don't take shortcuts, helps ensure you have appropriate practices, and maintains the integrity of the drinking water analytical results. Again, you cannot audit quality into an organization. You can only assess and evaluate and make sure it's being done correctly, give everybody the authority to do their job correctly, making sure they're competent to do that job. Certification, again, the oversight is done by EPA, it's done by the state. Certification of labs is only to a test method. The management of the lab is not being audited. They're held responsible if there's any fraudulent practice that goes on, but they're not really being audited as a part of the audit certification process. Again, the way they operate their lab can be anything to support operations, except if it's part of a test method, is not really as part of the audit, and there's some here listed. So certification is done under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It requires testing of drinking water be performed by a certified lab. Accreditation is accepted as comparable to the certification. Again, but you can do more with accreditation of a sampling and or testing organization, and there's more details that are required in 1725 to make sure that organization is competent to do that work. So one of the things that's required in 17025 is the laboratory must manage the competency of their organization. So accreditation is going to verify the competency of management to ensure all these things are taking place. Again, most labs don't worry about their management. Management knows how to do their job. Well, when I took over my first lab, I didn't know how to manage. I thought I did. I thought I knew all about this. And I didn't learn about this till I became an assessor, and I found out what it meant to manage and be accredited. It was so different from anything I ever saw before. And then I went out and started to see labs that were doing this, and I saw the difference between the labs that could do it and the labs that weren't doing it. And it was very, very eye-opening. So again, management's going to require an assessment of their own laboratory because they want to ensure their management is competent to perform either drinking water or any other environmental work. They're going to participate in proficiency testing to evaluate the data they're producing, and they're going to require the laboratory to act impartially. Again, we say that, we mean management doesn't put pressure on the analysts to get work done on time. They put pressure on the lab analysts to do their job correctly, and that's what's more important. You don't want to put pressure on somebody, get the job out today by 3 o'clock. Well, if you do that, people are going to take shortcuts. And when you take those kinds of shortcuts, they will make mistakes and they won't necessarily document everything. They won't have the records to be able to prove what they did. So a competent organization for sampling and or testing is going to be one that's accredited. The SDWA is going to make sure the program is done correctly. They're going to make sure the audit is correct. They're going to have the right tests being done by that certified lab. But where the sample came from and how it was actually generated, you'll never know. A competent organization will know both sample collection and or drinking water and other environmental media. You make sure that it's performed by a competent organization. An accredited organization is a lot different than a certified organization. Again, if they're competent, the data and information reported is going to be objective, impartial, and hasn't had the undue client influence or management influence to say that number has to go out right now. So in summary, a laboratory that has a sampling plan identifies the statistical methods when they're applicable to that sampling plan, that does that correctly. They follow the sample collection method exactly. They follow their test methods, and that they have to meet regulatory requirements. And they're going to have records that demonstrate everything all along the way that they can do this job. Again, when it's done by it's an accredited lab, and sampling and testing is done by an accredited lab for drinking water, management must have all these things. Accreditation will help to ensure a valid and reliable data from a laboratory or in any field or testing operation. Well, with that, I'll turn it back to Natalia.
Thank you, Marlene. Marlene, I'm going to take control from you. so that I can give a couple of more slides. Before we move into the Q&A portion of this presentation, I would like to introduce a couple of more resources that ANAB has. So ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management system, and assessment. On the ANAB website, there are free webcasts on a variety of topics. These webcasts are about 15 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and can be viewed at any time. ANAB also has a blog page with a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and others. We are also going to have these type of webinars monthly. Please check our website for the upcoming topics. And finally, ANAB offers training in many areas, including internal auditing, standards, risks, and other topics. As with assessments, training has changed significantly with the pandemic and travel restrictions. All of our traditional in-person courses have been converted to online version and include exercises and discussions related to the topic at hand. And we also offer web-based, self-paced training. All of these resources can be found at the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. Now let's get to the fun part, your questions. Okay, I had a couple of questions come in. Please do put your questions into Q&A. I do want to stress it out because that would help me to direct questions to Marlene and make sure I didn't miss any. But I do see a couple of them came into a chat, so I will try to get them answered out of the chat. And I apologize if I miss any. If I do miss your question, please put them into Q&A. Okay, Marlene, the first question is SDWA certification reciprocal between different states?
No, not always. Some states do accept each other, but some states do not. So you really have to go state by state to know if it's reciprocal.
Okay. The next question is EPA in its SDWA regulations considering expansion to include management?
The last time I talked to somebody at EPA was a couple years ago, and they have thought about it, but it's so hard to get laws passed right now, they aren't considering anything new.
Okay. Next question is, does an audit for SDWA certification include management review?
No, not in the non-accredited, not in the certification program. The accreditation program, yes, but the certification program, there is no such thing as management review.
Okay, wonderful. Next one. Do all states, as opposed to TNIAB, accept accreditation as sufficient evidence of SWGA compliance?
No. No, because this gets into the reciprocity thing. If you have a state like Pennsylvania that is in a TNIAB, whether their accreditations are accepted by another state, whether they're TNI or not, is really up to that other state. They have to have their laws. What it boils down to is a state has to review, state A has to review what state B does. If they like what state B does, they will accept them. If they don't, whether it's certification or accreditation, it doesn't matter. So it's very difficult, and that's why I say some states will accept anybody. They don't review anything. They just say, oh, yeah, we'll accept you. But other states are very adamant. They only accept certain ones because they don't trust the other ones with their drinking water or with their laboratory testing because in the past they've had some bad blood between them. There may have been some problems that weren't caught by the other states. So it's very difficult to tell what is going on right now. but laboratories are starting to look at accreditation. It's more expensive. They don't want to do it. So they fight a lot of times. But when they do it, they recognize the benefits of it, and they're very happy they did.
Awesome.
Hopefully I answered the question.
I'm not seeing a follow-up, so I would say you did. Okay, next question is, why is validation of method a dotted line in a D box? Is there no requirement in 17025 for a lab to validate a method? I'm guessing this question came in as in one of your slides. I'm not sure which one.
In the certification program, in the drinking water and many environmental laws, the laboratory is not required to validate a method in the traditional sense of validation. They can, this gets highly technical, TNI does require the laboratory to demonstrate their capability to perform that method. And TNI calls it a demonstration of capability. So every analyst has to prove that they can run or do their operations or their tests correctly. But that's a TNI requirement. Some states, in the state certification program, they mandate the analyst has to demonstrate to the state auditor that they can perform the method correctly actually in front of them, either through doing the test directly in front of them and or doing a proficiency test sample right in front of them. Some states will look at the method. Remember, all the methods in the drinking water program are validated by EPA and approved by EPA. So there's no reason for a laboratory to actually validate a method in the traditional sense of 17025. Validation in 17025 can be everything from soup to nuts. It could be, it's whatever the client needs you to validate what you want, the client wants you to do. But the environmental programs, typically, the newer ones, if you're doing a new method, you may have to validate it for you and the EPA, and it may be rigorous. They do it with different matrices. There's a whole validation protocol. It's called the Alternate Test Procedure Protocol, ATP. They also have equivalency protocols now. There's a lot of different ways this can be done, but it's not, those of us that have been in science a long time, validation is a very rigorous process. Like ASTM has a whole validation protocol, and it's very rigorous. You have to look at ruggedness, robustness, accuracy, precision, all this stuff, uncertainty, and that usually isn't looked at in the environmental methods. It's done by EPA. That's what it says. They're done by EPA. That answer it?
If I have any follow-ups, I'll let you know. Next question is, what is the relationship between TNI and ISO 17025 accreditation? Is a TNI accredited lab an ISO 17025 lab?
TNI used ISO 1725 to develop their standards, but they added a lot of additional requirements in order to meet regulatory requirements in the many states. So they wrote a standard that uses not only 1725, but also additional requirements. That's why I called it a scheme. In today's language, that would be called a scheme, because you're adding things to the standard. A 1725 accreditation is separate. It could be the same, it could be different. Some ABs are offering a 17025 along with a TNI accreditation. But there are, TNI is a lot more specific. They have a lot more specificity to it than 1725. 1725 is more general. So you can be a 1725 lab, but not meet the TNI requirements. If you're meeting the TNI requirements by a third-party accreditation body, an NGAB, you're probably meeting 17025. State accreditation bodies cannot do 17025 alone because they haven't been recognized as an AB under the 17011 requirements under the international MLA, multilateral arrangement.
Okay,
I hope that made sense. That got pretty complicated.
Again, I don't see any follow-up, so looks like you've answered the question. Okay, we have 4 more minutes, so I'll try to squish a couple of more questions in. So let's move on to the next one. Does accreditation ensure that no problems such as fraud occurs from an accredited lab?
No, it doesn't, and that's the big problem. That's why a lot of people go, well, why should I do it? Well, nobody can ever, you can't audit quality in, you can't make fraud go away. People are going to be people. Management helps to ensure that that problem does go away by proper management. But, laboratories sometimes change management. You go in one day, they're doing a great job, and a week later they change all the management, and now you get new management in there, and they do it wrong, but they're still accredited. They have to notify their AB that they changed management. So it's one way to help deter that. But again, then the AB has to go in and verify that that new management is doing things right. That could take a month or 2. So during that time, they could generate data that's improper, not a proper practice. So again, there's change always happening, and the change has to be managed. And that's why I said early on, a lot of times an organization doesn't manage their change properly. And that if that management change can be an influence on how you have fraud. It's not, you can't accredit that into an organization.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Who takes drinking water and other samples if not the laboratory?
Who does what?
I'm sorry. Who takes drinking water and other samples if not the laboratory?
The utilities themselves take the drinking water samples. They might hire a contractor to do it. It might be a guy off the street that does sample collection. They may have no affiliation with the lab. It may be an engineering firm they hire that does the sample collection for them. It could be anybody. And anybody could bring it to the lab and say they're from this public water supply and here's the water test. And that's why there's such a vulnerability there to make sure that that sample is collected from the proper spot as defined by the permit. Hopefully that's the last question.
As a follow-up question, do states require the labs to take samples?
No, not most states. And some states have started to. On the cannabis, they'll ask them to do it, but not in the drinking water.
Okay, and I have 2 more questions, and then we'll be done for the day. One more, the next one, does accreditation ensure the data is always correct?
No, it can only be as good as the sample that's tested and the method that was selected by the client and or the regulatory agency, so it doesn't always mean it's correct.
And I guess the follow-up to that question is coming through. What are the benefits for an organization to be accredited?
The benefit is that you learn the organization will learn how to be better managed. They will have a continuous improvement process, and they will learn how to manage change. That's one of the things that accreditation will teach anyone. It isn't just looking for things that are wrong. You're really trying to demonstrate to the assessor that the organization has a very good process for managing change of the organization. A lot of times, the organization has overlooked a lot of things, and they may not have realized there's a lot of holes in their system, and the assessor will point that out. That's why it's a big advantage to do that.
Thank you, Marlene. That's all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you for the wonderful questions. If you would like any additional information about training offered by ANAB, you can email us at training@anab.org. If you have any questions about accreditation or other services ANAB provides, you can email us anab@anab.org. And finally, if you're ready for a quote for accreditation services, you can contact Roger Muse at rmuse@anab.org. Thank you very much. And like I said, the recording will be available on ANAB website in a couple of days. Thank you, Marlene, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.